Without much ado, I would like to introduce you to today's speaker, John Fawcett. John is an international staff care expert who's currently working as an independent consultant. He has over 20 years of experience leading staff care initiatives in complex humanitarian contexts. He was a past director of staff care for Save the Children US and has most recently worked in Haiti, Sudan, Jordan, and Turkey, to name a few countries. He's the author of Stress and Trauma Handbook, released in 2003, and has also worked very closely with the Disaster Ready team to develop a number of online training resources, which I will share with you towards the end of this webinar. John, it's all yours.
Thank you, Atish. And well, I was going to say good morning, but it's actually just greetings from New Zealand, where it's a lovely, clear autumn morning, and I'm looking forward to our time today. Obviously, we would like this webinar to be as interactive as possible, so we're going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, and where we can all hopefully get more engaged with the subject of the webinar today. So in terms of questions, you can just type them into the chat window to the host, presenter, and panelists, and Atish will gather them up, and at the end of my talking, we'll have a chance to examine some of those questions. And any questions that we can't get to, then we'll also gather those up, and I will take a look at those, and we can always add them to the Disaster Ready org site at a later date. So we'll try and answer all the questions we can today, but anything you can't get answered, we will try and cover later on. So a bit of background, personal information. As Atish said, I've been working in international humanitarian work for over 20 years. Back in New Zealand now, which is my home country, and working as a consultant to international NGOs throughout the world, and most recently in Jordan and Turkey, working in the Syrian refugee crisis. I began my international career back in humanitarian work in Cambodia in the early 1990s, just at the end of the Pol Pot regime. And since then, I've worked in a lot of different locations around the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, the Middle East. I was the first director of staff support for World Vision International out of California, and as Atish said, most recently the director for staff support for Save the Children US. So the focus of my work over those years has been on the safety and well-being of humanitarian workers, and I've been involved in the development of adequate support processes for staff since really the beginning of my involvement in humanitarian work. Now, right back at the beginning, our focus was on the psychological needs of individual staff, and the most support processes that we had were actually aimed at individual stress management training. But in the last 20 years, we've learned so much more about how to enhance resilience and promote thriving. And one factor that stood out as a major support to resilience is the process of what we call social support. Now, social support has many different activities, and we're not going to cover all of those today, but one that has proved very important and also a bit hard to nail down is that of leadership. Before we go on to the topic in greater detail, it would be helpful to us to just conduct a short poll. We'll have a couple of these during the webinar today, and Atish is going to put up the poll on the bottom right of your screen. And if you could just select one of those options and let us know, and we'll be able to get a read as to, the audience's experience. So I'll give you a few seconds to have a go at that. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So we've opened the poll up. As John said, it's open at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and we'll keep this open for about 30 more seconds. Great. I'm going to close the poll now. Last chance to vote. Okay, we have our results, which I'm going to share with you as well. So, John, back to you so you can see the results down at the bottom right-hand side of the screen as well.
Thank you, Atish. And if you will move me to the ownership of the slides, I'll move. Thank you. I'll move those forward. So I'm going to frame the discussion about leadership and staff care today in looking at Syria, because that's my most recent experience in terms of humanitarian work and staff care. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a background about the way in which I view the Syrian refugee crisis and what I think is different about it, and how that impacts our role as leaders in terms of delivering programs in disaster contexts. So I've got 3 points that I just want to briefly make before we move into the discussion about leadership. The differences for me in Syria are about the time frame, the demographics, and the context. So let's just take a look at the time frame for a start. I see this as a long-term civil war that has very little sign of ending very soon. Extremely violent, encompasses most of Syria, and the result has been a huge movement of people internally and across borders. In some sense, this can be viewed as a semi-evacuation of the whole country. And at the same time, over the past 3 years, the people fighting the war have changed significantly. What started off as a democratic protest movement has now morphed into a war involving many different parties, some with hardline agendas and often at odds with each other. Syria is no longer a two-party war, it's a schoolyard brawl with heavy weapons and shifting allegiances. And the Syria that we knew of over 3 years back has now gone forever. So to some extent, what has started off as an emergency refugee process really has become the relocation of population into new living centres. We think of them as temporary, but for people who are living in a refugee camp for 3, 5, 10 years, it becomes a lot more than just a temporary situation. This is a large percentage of the nation being relocated into a different place, in a different country. Demographics. These are somehow different to some of the other crises we've seen at this kind of level. We call them camps, but really that's a misnomer. They're actually more medium-sized cities, particularly in northern Jordan. What we've seen at Zatari camp in northern Jordan is a new densely populated city and made up of the whole range of Syrian social strata. A large percentage of this refugee population were middle-class business people who previously had access to good public and community services and aware of political subtleties, used to being able to purchase a wide range of consumer products, and well used to exerting and being involved with economic and political processes. The result is that these new cities develop many of the characteristics of new settlement towns. So we're thinking about this context as being civil society as well as being refugee camps. The third one is the contexts. The contexts into which many of these refugees have relocated are different to some of the others. In Jordan specifically, Syrians have particular rights as a result of their Syrian citizenship. And in the early stage of the crisis, many Syrians moved into rental accommodation in Amman and other Jordanian cities, as they did in Iraq and Lebanon as well. They sent their children to local schools, as is their right, and they became, setting up business enterprises. So the existence of these legal rights mean that Syrians in Jordan can and do have certain expectations of life in their new country. They are immigrants with protected rights of employment, health services, and education. So as a result of the development of the major camps such as Zatari, it's an urban development process that will become the ultimate responsibility of the Jordanian authorities. So even if today management and budgets are primarily supported by the international community, everyone knows that if this crisis continues for any great length of time, the investment from the international community will diminish and the investment from local government will have to increase. So in terms of managing this refugee crisis, the participation of the Jordanian government at all levels of planning and administration must be paramount. Really, this is the only long-term sustainable approach. And if we as the international aid community are unable to achieve this, then we could be in danger of influencing a split between Jordan and Jordan's new immigrants. This is quite critical. And again, before we get into the meat of the discussion, let's pause for another poll that Atish is going to put up for us. Atish.
Thanks, John. So from the last poll, we learned that our audience, most of our audience have longer than 3 years of experience. So 14 of our 33 participants have more than 3 years of experience. So now to learn a little bit more about you, we've opened up a new poll looking to see where you are posted, whether it's field-based, regional, or a head office. So you'll see the poll open down at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. We'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll close the poll. Okay. So as you can see, the results of the poll are in, and 16 of our 36 participants are from head office locations. We've got a fairly significant number from field-based offices and a smaller percentage from regional management. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Atish. That's really interesting, actually. I'm pleased to see that we've got quite a large percentage of people from head office. I worked in head office contexts twice in my career, as well as regional and field-based. And I know from experience that the context and culture of those different locations is significantly influential in terms of how we perceive and how we act in terms of our programming. So it's really good to see that that spread there, and I hope that in the discussion that we come to about leadership and management and leadership from remote situations, we might be able to attend to some of those issues that I've identified. So let's move on to the meat of this presentation, which is about staff care and leadership. Now, as I said right at the beginning, we've come a long way in the development of staff care services for humanitarian aid staff. We started with this individual psychological health model and aimed our strategies at teaching individual people how to manage their stress. There was an early assumption that psychological trauma would be common amongst aid workers, so we had this emphasis on techniques such as critical incident stress debriefing, individual and personal stress management, all that kind of stuff focused on significant psychological pressure. Fortunately, at the same time as that, we began to conduct solid research on the incidence and nature of stress and trauma in aid work. And we found, hardly surprisingly, that some of our assumptions were wrong. The incidence of psychological trauma, for example, was not as high as predicted. And we also discovered that the application of Western mental health models towards the development of individual health processes was not as universally useful as we had assumed. Really, at the beginning of our staff care initiatives and humanitarian work, we were focused on survival. That was survival of the worker in the face of extreme odds and challenges. We had read interviews of aid workers expressing deeply felt emotions and sometimes despair. We witnessed unspeakable scenes in Rwanda and Sierra Leone and Kosovo and Afghanistan and other places. We were deeply and profoundly impacted by these experiences. And so the first step of stress management was aimed at helping us survive and cope. But as the research continued and as we talked amongst ourselves, we found the picture changing significantly. Many of us really resented the assumption that we were walking wounded, damaged, and wrecked by our experiences, becoming psychologically deformed by what we had seen, taken part in, or had been exposed to. Sure, we all knew friends and colleagues who had been through hell and back out the other side, and the truth is that some of them didn't make it out, either healthy or even alive in some cases. But what we learned overall was that most of us not only survived, but we thrived in those environments. Many of us argued that we became better people as a result of our experiences and our careers in humanitarian work, not damaged and disabled people. So what's going on here with all of this? The research has been able to identify the core factors that not only build resilience, but lead to growth and an ability to thrive in what I consider personally, and I'm biased, as the most exciting work in the world. And a core factor that comes out of all of the research is the enhancing and building of resilience is based on what we call social support, or in other words, relationships. What we know is that people with strong social support networks tend to do much better than those that have poor social support. And we're now making use of this in our staff support and staff care programs by emphasizing the need and usefulness of networks of friends and colleagues and families. And we're beginning the long and very hard process of institutionalizing social support into employment and human resource policies and practices. That's difficult for organizations that come out of the West that are based around individual employment practices and a separation between what we classify in the West as life and work. So we struggle at a cultural, institutional level of trying to be able to build social support into our programming at the same time as we only employ individuals and not families and friends. So in the workplace, we found that there are aspects of social support that are very important to the overall protection provided to people in this work against psychological and also physical health damage. So two of these are the ways team functions, so that's team functioning in crisis involvements, and the roles of leaders. We've seen that team building's become a strong influence in humanitarian work because it builds on principles of social support that not only build individual resilience but also team resilience, and also obviously increase the likelihood of achieving your program objectives. So things get done, and they get done better, and they get done more effectively when teams work together well. Now, personally, I think in disaster response, the idea that a team can be built is more of an aspiration than a realistic outcome for all of the reasons of logistical and pragmatic concerns that we all know about. Most of all, to me, the incredible mobility of individual aid workers makes the building of teams in specific disaster locations quite hard to achieve. And social support networks are at their best when membership is long-term and enduring. And many particularly international disaster workers, their relationships are transitory and time-limited and difficult to maintain in that disaster context. So the efficacy of team support is somewhat limited. It can be increased, but I still think it is limited, and it's definitely worth working on. The other key factor is leadership, and I think that possibly leadership poses more opportunities for us in the humanitarian sector to influence and develop, because we can identify particular people who are leaders or who will be leaders. We know that leadership is profoundly influential on health and well-being. We know now that leadership can either be a strong social support mechanism or it can poison a social network. A strong team can be ripped apart by toxic leaders. And once the relationships are broken, the incidence of psychological injury to the team members increases dramatically. And we've seen that time and time again with the research. We've seen it in situations where there's very little external threat, either physical or community, to teams. Poor leadership, those teams experience high levels of clinical, psychological stress and illness. Alternatively, in other situations where threat levels are very high, with good leadership, we find very, very low clinical measures of stress and psychological trauma on team members. So leadership is a critical component to keeping people strong and keeping people well. I think it's actually impossible to be neutral as a leader. We're either going to be a positive influence or we'll be a negative one. And the tougher the circumstances, the more important and more significant the practices and behaviors of leaders become. So it's in disaster context that the role of the leader plays in enhancing resilience and building teams is very, very strong. It's very pivotal. And when a crisis is immediate, it's exhausting and threatening and complex, the leader has very few opportunities to make mistakes in leadership and recover from them. Leadership needs to be able to hit the ground running and demonstrate this very strong leadership capacity from the very first minute the program starts. It's not really a good place for a person to practice being a leader because the stakes are too high. We've identified some of the characteristics of good leadership. A good leader will work in the same context as the team that they lead. And by that, to be colloquial about it, that means getting their hands dirty. That means getting out there and working with their team, living in similar accommodation, traveling in the same vehicles, leading from the front, getting out into the field with teams, not sitting in air-conditioned offices back at the base. Just a couple of examples of what I've seen in the past of very, very good examples of leadership. This is going back a while, so forgive me for going back into the last millennium. In Sierra Leone, when we had the major evacuations back in the 1990s, we're evacuating our whole team out of Sierra Leone into Senegal. What we did was we brought in the most senior person we could find in the organization, a senior vice president, flew into Senegal to meet the plane that was evacuating the staff out of Sierra Leone. Now, that person had no operational oversight, wouldn't have been able to have managed a relief program in any sense at all, but his position and his status as a very senior vice president in the organization gave security to the evacuee, the evacuated staff and families, that the organization was taking their needs seriously. It was just being present. It was about a leader being present in exactly the same place where the staff were experiencing extreme pressures. In 1997, I went back into Cambodia after the small coup there, and our organization had decided to pull out pretty much all of our international staff for a period of time immediately as the coup ended. And I went back in as the interim country director, and I was pretty much the only international staff person there. The local staff were very apprehensive and concerned that what was going to happen was that we were going to leave the country and they would be left at the hands of what they saw as threatening circumstances. My presence, just my sheer presence, we actually didn't do very much while I was there for 3 weeks, but my presence indicated to those staff that this organization was committed in the long term. So we managed to reduce stress, and we managed to reduce that kind of injury, potential injury to staff, by just being present. That was a leadership practice. So in terms of what leaders need to do, leaders can do very, very well by getting to know their team members individually, by watching how team members are behaving, being aware of signs of stress and discomfort amongst their teams, making sure that they ask the hard questions of their teams, You know, what is going on here? How is this situation affecting you? We need to deal with that now. And knowing that there are resources available for staff if they need assistance. Making sure that staff have access to those resources. Don't just pass that on to someone else. Don't just pass that on to human resources, for example. Now, I'm not criticizing human resources. I've been an HR manager for most of my career. I think human resources people do a fantastic job. But a leader cannot delegate the responsibility of caring for their staff to someone else. The leader needs to be there with the staff who have situations or issues and make sure that they are cared for by the organization. In the past, we made the mistake in assuming that management was the same as leadership, and we now know that this is not the case. Just because a person was an excellent finance manager doesn't imply that the same person will be a fantastic financial leader, and neither do brilliant logistics managers easily become team leaders. Management is not scalable into leadership. Now, both leadership and management are scalable, but they're actually different processes, and we need to be aware of the differences. Leaders are taking primary responsibility for building effective teams and making it possible for managers to get the operations underway. So what works well in leadership? Effective leaders are able to incorporate local realities into program activities. So this means not just thinking about the things that this needs to happen, but actually involving the impacted community and the host communities in practical, pragmatic, and operational planning and implementation. Now, this is the way to build strong teams, because all of our teams in disaster contexts are going to have a high number of local staff. And when program activities are delivered by teams that comprise both locals and outsiders, social support is strengthened, and in my opinion, it's basically only my opinion, but I still think it's valid, objectives are much more likely to be attained when teams work together well. So that's a role that leaders have to take leadership in. It's much too easy to arrive in country with our own teams and then set them to the task of meeting the needs. But if a leader can be released from management activities in order to build strong local social networks with local team members in the local communities, then everything will be more effective and much more sustainable. So obviously this means working closely with pre-existing local government services and leadership. And in Jordan, just as my example, this is critical. Because the context of the country that has quite a strong and quite an effective public sector, and we are the guests coming with resources, we need to make it a major objective to form strong personal relationships with local leaders. And this has to be the responsibility of the leader of the disaster team. And I know this sounds like it's coming a little bit from left field, but it's something rather that I've learned a lot of in the last few years. We as leaders need to stop being reluctant to consider spirituality in staff support. Now, I'm not talking about organized religion, but about something different. There's a difference between organized religion and spirituality in the same way that there's a difference between good management and good leadership. Now, we haven't got a lot of time to go into the differences here, but just I'm signaling this as something rather because the research is showing some very interesting things about spirituality and resilience. In the West, we have somewhat oddly tended to move spirituality to the realm of the personal and the private, and certainly not in the corporate sector. Yet most of the world doesn't work that way. And the research into psychological health shows that a person's spirituality is very influential in terms of resilience and growth. Now, we tend to compartmentalize these things in the West, but actually this isn't very good for our health. Now, in my opinion, what I've found is that Westerners are not very good at clearly articulating views on spirituality, and we tend to default to religion as the topic. Yet if we're going to effectively build staff care processes with local staff in the complex disaster context, we need to figure out ways to have these conversations. In order to achieve this, we need to invite the spiritual leaders to get into these contexts and discussions with us. I just want to, moving on towards the end of the webinar here and leaving time for questions, I've thought to myself about some of the assumptions that we've made about remote management, and I know that not all of these are valid, but I think that they're things that are worthwhile thinking about in terms of leadership, because leadership is the part of disaster response that really can make or break a program. Sometimes there's an assumption made that the Syrian crisis is similar to Darfur or Somalia in terms of the numbers, in terms of the complexity of it. I don't think it is. In my experience, it's not the same as Darfur or Somalia or Haiti. And if we assume it is, then our planning will be less effective in the long term than it could be. If we assume that local expertise is not sufficient to meet the needs of a crisis, I think we've made a mistake. And as I said earlier, I found that Jordan has a public health service built around trained and equipped service providers. It's got a university-based training program, and it's connected to local and regional knowledge bases. There's a system of local community health centers throughout the country. So I talked with, when I was there in Amman, I talked with a number of the people that work in that sector. And the objective was to try and find out ways in which we in the staff care program could link with existing health programs provided by the Jordanian Ministry of Health and other government institutions. This is the way that actually builds better staff support for the staff that we've employed in our programs. An assumption that a program can be successful without involvement and investment in leadership capacity is a real mistake. Now, we're seeing some improvements in this. And if we perceive a refugee camp like Satari as just a tented community rather than a small city, we're going to make a big problem here. One of the assumptions that is made too often is that staff support processes are available. And my experience is that they really aren't. Some agencies do have good ones, but it's not as comprehensive as I would wish. And the idea that we can actually manage remotely rather than, as I said before, as a leader being involved in the day-to-day practice is a difficult thing to be successful in. We've talked about disaster response, and we know that food, water, and shelter are critical to success. However, I think that if we're going to really have a comprehensive disaster response, we need to look at practices that are going to build effective multicultural teams. We need to encompass social needs such as community relationships and as spirituality, as I've said before. So how will the Syrian experience change us? Well, as I've said, it's not Darfur or Somalia, or it's not Gaza or Kosovo. And I think that where we need to focus in terms of successful leadership in the future is to build skills in intercultural understanding and support, geopolitical, economic understanding, and inclusivity, which I'll talk a little bit about. I've experienced some excellent beginnings to this process with the larger NGOs in the Syrian context and some of the smaller ones. Building of relationships with the local and regional health services, connectivity with universities in Amman, and deliberate design and publication of Arabic language resources have been very, very impressive. And from the very beginning, UN agencies such as UNHCR have been very supportive of staff support programming. So I think that things are developing there and will be, there's good signs for the future. Improvements to staff care. We need to continue to develop staff care and staff support across the humanitarian sector. And in order to do this, I think an increasing focus on leadership capacity must be part of that. We have to actively pursue knowledge about health across all the cultures we work in. Western assumptions of psychological and physical health are inadequate in our work, and they must be broadened. We have to, therefore, begin a discussion as to what spirituality means in terms of building resilience, because most of the communities that we work in, they don't separate spirituality out from day-to-day life. And spirituality, as I've said before, has been shown to be a very strong means to build resilience. How do we incorporate that into our staff care programs? That has to be something that leadership has to take responsibility for. And unless and until staff care is a fundamental, non-negotiable, compact component of every single disaster response plan and every single donor funding request, we're not going to have comprehensive staff support processes across the sector. This is only my personal opinion, and I state that as my personal opinion only, just as John Fawcett. It may not reflect the opinions of Disaster Ready or everybody else. But I believe personally that the lack of universal humanitarian sector commitment to comprehensive staff support processes in all aspects of this work is today, as it stands in 2014, is unforgivable. For decades we've known what we need to do to support disaster response staff, and it's actually just a lack of will on the part of the agencies that this hasn't been addressed in the same comprehensive sense that we have addressed security management. We need to do better as a sector in terms of that. And basically what I'd like to see is leadership from the humanitarian sector in terms of developing comprehensive staff support and leadership capacity across the sector. So look, Atish and all, I'm going to stop talking here now and hand back to Atish so that we can have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, John, for that and for sharing your knowledge and experiences on the importance of good leadership in emergencies. So just before we go to questions, I also wanted to share some of the other resources that we have developed together with John Fawcett, including the webinar last year with John on cross-cultural team building in emergency settings, the wellness briefing course, which we released in summer last year, aimed at staff members, and more recently the staff care for managers course that's aimed at the challenges faced by humanitarian managers and helping them sort of make critical decisions to effectively manage and support their teams. So all these resources, in addition to the current webinar, are available and on disasterready.org. So do go and have a look if you haven't already, and please do share this with your other colleagues as well. So moving to questions, we've gotten a few questions here from our participants, but please do send any other questions that you would like through the chat window. So let's start with a question from Ashley. We seem to acknowledge stress and emotional stress with our expat staff, but don't have the same degree of concern with our national staff. How would you encompass all staff with the same level of concern?
Yeah, that's an absolutely excellent question there, and I think I'd like to just pass some reassurance on that. One of the things that we've really begun to appreciate in the humanitarian sector as we've looked at demographics is the startling reality that most management statistically in humanitarian work is actually done by local staff. Statistically, in fact, most work is done by people employed locally, and the numbers of international staff are relatively few in terms of who actually does the work. I've been, for the last 3 years, or 4 years actually now, I've been involved in an initiative with colleagues to develop prototypes for how we would effectively address the issues that national staff have in terms of being resilient and being strong. Interaction in the United States funded a major program that I was a leader of in Sudan and Chad 3 years back, when we were developing a template for ways in which we could begin to address the national staff issues. It is a hard push, because the truth is that most agencies really don't want to release the funding in order to address the issues of national staff. But I think that what we need to do is to continue to ask it, and I would encourage anybody who has that as a concern to ask that question of their agency. What are we doing to address the needs of national staff? And the encouragement I have to say to you is that there are some very good resources out there. Look, contact us at Disaster Ready and ask the question for templates and resources. A lot of that stuff is in the public domain, and I, for one, am very happy to, send that material on to anyone who wants to have a look at it and put you to the right direction. Because for me personally, it's my primary focus at the moment is on the needs of national staff. Absolutely critical. Totally agree with you.
Thanks very much, John. We have a question from Joseph. In a conflict situation, wouldn't the use of host leadership create an atmosphere of tension or partiality?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question as well, and I think that what I was really meaning to say and didn't say it clearly enough, I think, is that leadership in multicultural, cross-cultural, complex environments needs to be shared amongst all of the interested parties. Now, obviously, an organization, a private organization, can employ whoever it likes to be their program managers. But I think one of the skills of a leader is to be able to really work very, very closely with the key people in the local context. So what I'm wanting leaders to be able to demonstrate is the ability to identify from host communities who are the people that I need to know personally and spend time with in order to make sure that this operation is going to be successful for the target population. So there's a difference between the skill of leadership and a position in an organizational structure. So, and I think that's why we really need to focus on what is leadership and what does it mean. We will find leaders in the local community who may not necessarily be in positions of, high structural places and status within the community. And a leader needs to be able to figure out who is the best person to work with. Working collaboratively and cooperatively with host leaders is going to be much more sustainable. But I agree with you. I think we have a ways to go on this, and that's why I'm excited about any investment in leadership development.
Thanks, John. We have a question from Laurie. How do you get this understanding of leadership development and improving staff care started in an organization that has historically not developed managers and much less leaders?
That's a great question, and it's all too common, really, isn't it? One of the ways I would do it is, and I've done in the past, is a kind of like a marketing campaign, really. It's about building your own individual leadership for a start, taking whatever opportunities that you have that can improve your own leadership, and inviting others that are close colleagues in your social network to take part in those same things. So if you can find an initiative somewhere or other that works on leadership development, and if you can persuade your organization to fund that, or if you can do some for free, then do that yourself and lead by example. That the more you lead by example, the more people who respect and know you will follow, and that is how we change culture. One of the really big things that we're up against in terms of all of our organizational structure in disaster work is the reality that in any organization, doesn't matter what it is, whether it's humanitarian work or the media or anything at all, is that people of experience tend to end up at the top of organizations. The reality is that experience was often gained 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And so many of those people, or not many of them, some of those people feel a little bit apprehensive when we start talking about differences between leadership and management and the characteristics of leadership. There's a tendency for them to take it personally as a criticism, that I don't have these skills, therefore you're criticizing me, therefore let's not go there as an organization. So I'd say, the bottom line is, what can you do to develop yourself? What can you do to access skills and knowledge and understanding as a leader? And then how can you demonstrate that leadership in your organizational context in ways that will influence the organizational culture? And reach out to others who are doing the same thing so that your own personal social support network is strong and will support you in this. And there are some good blogs, there are some good networks that can help you do that. Disaster Ready is one of those. There are many others as well.
Thanks, John. Just related to that as well, we did have a question from Gretchen who said she was very interested in some of your research you had mentioned previously. Would it be possible to share links? So if any of the research which you mentioned in your presentation, if you share that with us, we can certainly share that with the participants on the webinar.
Yeah. That's a good idea, and just to comment on that, I think that at the end of the webinar there are a number of links that will be available, and a lot of those links will take us to research as well, but I can easily add in some specific ones to research as well.
Thanks so much, John. Finally, we have a question on how can you share more on how you would encourage spirituality to be included in staff care?
I would go back to what I said about leadership development in organizations that don't really want to get involved in that. And it's the same thing with spirituality. What we've done with the model that we're working on for addressing the needs of national staff is to basically start off the process sitting down in a room with national staff and saying, tell us what it is that provides you with the most support. So it's kind of like an open whiteboard or an open blackboard. There's nothing up there that presupposes that a particular strategy is going to be better for you. So we do not go in there and say these are the research answers to what is stress and what causes stress and what builds resilience. We go in there and with a blank page we say life often has pain and suffering in it. What is it that helps you cope with that? And almost every time in every context, spirituality will be listed on the list of things that helps me get through the day. When people raise a condition like that in a workshop, then you can begin to address it. You can talk, how does spirituality provide you with support? What is it about spirituality that is best for you in terms of building your own resilience and helping you to cope? And what are the things that don't work with spirituality? What are the things that actually make it harder for you to do that? Once the question is in the public domain within the organization, you really can't let it go, because the other part of any kind of staff care strategy with national staff, it must finish with a what are the next steps. So in our model, when we start off asking those basic questions, what causes you pain, what helps keep you strong, we're always going to end our workshop with a lot of time, about 25% of the time, on what are the next steps. And what are the next steps has to be built on what people have identified as the issues and as the support mechanisms. We're always going to incorporate spirituality into our next steps. And how we do that is going to be based on local realities and local conditions. So again, it's leadership. It's leadership from the top. It's leadership from being involved in the issues, and it's actually allowing the subject of spirituality to be discussed and then permeate through the culture of the organization.
Thanks, John. We actually had a couple of questions come in again. So just link to the topic of resilience. There's a question from Gretchen asking, is there a connection between the area of resilience, which is staff resilience, the worker and team resilience, and the focus on community resilience, that is the resilience of affected communities themselves? So do you see any link between staff resilience and the affected population's resilience?
So in the interest of time, let me just say absolutely yes in big capital letters to start off with. What we've often forgotten is that in most disaster responses, the national staff are also survivors of the disaster. And so therefore, if there's any kind of psychosocial programming that is going on with those communities, why would the impacted community not include that national staff, local staff that we have hired? And I found in one of the things that really, really got me exercised, energetic, and annoyed in Haiti when I was there was that people who were employed by the agencies were excluded from being beneficiaries of programs. And yet these staff had lost family members and houses and homes in exactly the same way that all of their friends and family who were now beneficiaries. So my feeling is that to distinguish national staff from the local community in terms of what they're experiencing and what they're building is a mistake. Now, we know that work is itself supportive, but just because someone's employed doesn't mean to say that we've met all of their needs. So anything that we can do that builds social support among staff needs to be replicated in building community resilience. And if a community is resilient because they have strong social support, then I think our national staff and our staff generally will likely to be more resilient. So it works both ways, and I think we should focus on that. It's a great question.
Thanks, John. And we'll take one last question here from John as well. It has been observed that understanding contingencies is an important component in resilience. For example, if security deteriorates beyond a certain condition, I will adopt certain measures, be or be not evacuated, for example. These may apply differently to local staff, which may impact their morale. Your thoughts on this?
Basically, the question is about the connection between security and social support and resilience. And I think that the people that are most likely to say, yes, that's obvious, are the security experts. And I've worked in security training in humanitarian work for 15, 20 years. And the security staff, the security experts know absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, that every question that you can apply in a security preparedness context is exactly the same question that you ask in terms of staff care and resilience. So the two are close together. People will be strongly supported when security is sound, physical security, because physical security and psychological security, they're the same thing. If we don't have strong security, we will not have strong social support. If we don't have strong social support, we're likely to see an increase in psychological and physical health concerns. So they go hand in hand, and if we address local staff security poorly, then we will have a whole lot of issues that relate to resilience and care and concern for the whole organization, not just for the people themselves who are affected. We can't get away from it. They are one and the same, and they need to be addressed in the same context.
Thanks so much, John. We are still getting a few questions. We will try our best to capture these and send responses after this webinar. We can also continue this conversation on Twitter, so if you continue to post questions on hashtag #DisasterReady or at our DisasterReady1 handle, we can continue this discussion beyond this webinar. So just before we close this webinar, I just wanted to let you know of our upcoming webinar in April, on the 22nd of April, with Dr. Alex Van Tulken, who is the Academic Director of the International Institute of Humanitarian Affairs at the Fordham University, and he'll be talking about advancing your humanitarian career in an age of professionalization. I would also encourage you to, if you have any questions, you can write an email to us at info@disasterready.org, and there are a number of social channels that you can connect with us, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I would like to again take this opportunity to thank John Fawcett for taking the time to share his experiences, for sharing his knowledge with us through this Disaster Ready webinar. And thanks to all the participants for attending today.